Hi, everybody. Karen Roby here for ZDNet. Talking today about biometrics and how it's being used now more often to authenticate people. Daphne LaPrance-Ronguet is one of our writers for ZDNet, joining me to talk about this. And Daphne, we're hearing so much more about biometrics now.
So in this particular example, the evidence that was brought forward by the banking giant HSBC, who mentioned that in the past year they've been able to protect up to almost £250 million worth of customer money thanks to voice recognition technology. If we look at the sort of numbers year on year, that's a 50% reduction in fraud committed over the telephone specifically, thanks to this voice technology called Voice ID. Since Voice ID was introduced in 2016, it's identified 43,000 telephone scams, so attempts at scam rather, and it's saved since 2016 just over £980 million worth of customer money. So it's quite impressive statistics there in terms of how much money can be saved and protected, and how many scammers can be identified thanks to this technology. What is Voice ID essentially is, as a HSBC customer, you can sign up to it simply by recording your voice, and then when in the future, at a future point, you call your bank app, instead of having to remember answers to security questions that you've forgotten, or instead of having to pull out bank numbers that you don't know where you've left them, you just have to speak a simple sentence and the technology will match your voice to the recording that you've already submitted to make sure that you are who you're saying you are. So there's obviously the convenience aspect to it, which is that you don't have to pull out all this paperwork that I just mentioned that most of us will have forgotten about. But there's also a security aspect that HSBC is putting forward, which is that you've only got one voice. It's hard to replicate your voice. This technology specifically analyzes over 100 behavioral traits in your voice, so how fast you speak, what words you emphasize, what your accent is, obviously. And thanks to these traits, we'll be able to make sure that when you speak, it is you that is speaking. According to HSBC, even if someone is playing a recording, even if someone is trying to pretend to be you, while at the same time being able to listen in through if you have a cold or a sore throat. So it's a very sophisticated technology in principle, that not only is more convenient, but also increases the security of those sometimes very sensitive transactions when they are carried out non-physically.
Yeah, and Daphne, again, we're hearing so much more about biometrics and how it's being used, regarding sensitive information with transactions and in its different forms as well.
Yes, definitely. So it's not just about voice recognition technology, even though that's the one that I just talked about. At the most basic level, when you're open, if you've got an iPhone, when you open your iPhone, you're using facial recognition technology to authenticate yourself. And increasingly, people are using digital means to carry out sensitive services. The COVID-19 pandemic, like in many other cases, has accelerated this, but it was already a trend that was growing. People are using digital means more. They're using digital means to carry out sensitive transactions, for example, payments. And when they carry out those transactions, it's obviously crucial to make sure that the person doing the transaction is the person that should be carrying out this transaction. For example, it's becoming more and more common to use your phone to pay in store, rather than using your credit card like we used to before. For payments specifically, there are many different ways to authenticate users. Facial recognition is one of them, but there's also fingerprint recognition, there's iris recognition, there's voice recognition, of course. Recent research showed that estimated rather that in 2025, 95% of phones will have some kind of biometrics technology implemented in order to authenticate payments and financial transactions. And it will be authenticating up to $3 trillion worth of financial transactions every year. So it's definitely a field that's growing. It makes sense given that, as I said, you've only got one fingerprint, you've only got one face, you've only got one voice, so it's more secure, and increasingly it's being used as a way of authenticating and making sure that the person who claims they are a certain person are that person.
All right, so Daphne, you talked a lot about here about the pros. What about the cons, potential problems that can come out of using biometrics in this way?
So the obvious answer is if someone manages to replicate all those biometric all these biometric identifiers, of course, everyone or all the vendors that are implementing these technologies are putting in place protocols and safety measures to make sure that this doesn't happen, that the technology is sophisticated enough to read through a fake or someone trying to impersonate someone else. But it remains that there could be some shortcomings. In fact, going back to the HSBC example in 2017, so a year after Voice ID was introduced, a BBC reporter and his twin brother managed to fool the voice recognition technology. So the twin brother eventually got access over the phone to his brother's bank account, its details, its statements. So that's an example of obviously in perhaps the rare case of having a twin brother that might be able to carry out this kind of action, but increasingly hackers and malicious actors are having access to sophisticated technologies like deepfakes that could enable them to replicate someone's voice or someone's face. So that's definitely something to worry about for the people, or rather for the vendors who are relying on these technologies to authenticate sensitive transactions. Another aspect to bear in mind is that all this data that's biometric data, that's sensitive data, is being stored somewhere. So we need to make sure that this data is being stored safely, because if it's compromised, then that's a huge problem. It's hugely problematic. As I said, you've only got one face and you've only got one set of fingerprints. If someone compromises that data, you can't change it. It's not like a password. So we need to make sure that the safety protocols are in place in order for this solution to work. And if it does, it will be safer than previous methods we have. But it is very important to make sure that it's done safely to benefit consumers and users down the road.
All right, Daphne, for much more, you guys, on biometrics, what you need to know, make sure you check out ZDNet. Thanks for watching.